The first crack was so thin it sounded like ice splitting on a pond, sharp, almost delicate, easy to ignore. And when the concrete wall began to give, it did not explode. It unraveled, sending a wall of cold, silent water down the valley with the patience of something that knew it could not be stopped. And miles away, a small farmhouse sat in the sun, windows open, engine parts laid out in the yard, unaware that the river had just changed its mind, and that within minutes the choice to run or stay would decide everything. June 5th, 1976, near Wilford, Idaho. The morning carried a dry heat that felt heavier than June should allow, and Daniel Harper stood beside his truck in a field that had not yet decided whether it would be generous or cruel that season. The radio balanced on the hood, muttering about structural concerns at Teton Dam, words too technical to sound urgent, too calm to force movement, and Daniel almost turned it off, because concern was not the same as danger, and he had an engine apart on the tailgate, bolts lined carefully on a rag, every piece placed in order, as if keeping order in small things could protect him from larger ones. Inside the farmhouse, Claire Harper was rinsing jars in the sink, the window open to let in air that smelled of dry soil and distant water. She heard the wind shift once, sharp and sudden, and then the faintest vibration through the glass. Not thunder, not machinery, something deeper, something that seemed to travel through the ground rather than above it. And she stepped outside, wiping her hands on a towel, meeting Daniel's eyes before either of them spoke, because they both felt it. A subtle change in the valley, like the pause before livestock bolt, like the silence before a train passes. The radio voice returned, less steady now, mentioning evacuation downstream, mentioning failure in a way that sounded accidental, almost embarrassed. And Daniel turned the volume higher, listening for a word that would force certainty. But certainty did not come. Only fragments, breach, uncontrolled release, move to higher ground. And Claire's first instinct was denial, because the river was miles away, because water did not climb hills, because their house had stood through storms and spring thaws, and fear without proof felt foolish. Yet Daniel was already moving, not running, not panicking, but scanning the horizon toward the distant line of cottonwoods that traced the river's path. At first there was nothing, only heat shimmering above fields, only the hum of insects, only the engine parts glinting in sunlight, and then the shimmer thickened into motion, a darkening strip that should not have been there, moving too fast to be wind in crops, too smooth to be dust. And Daniel felt something inside him tighten into a single, hard thought. This is real, this is now. And he grabbed Claire's wrist, not roughly, but with a grip that erased hesitation, and said, low and firm, we don't wait. They had minutes, maybe less, and every choice shrank into essentials, truck or roof, tools or water, neighbors or self. Claire looked back once at the kitchen window, at the jars she had just washed, at the ordinary stillness of a life that had not yet realized it was being measured against a wall of water. And then she climbed into the truck, heart pounding not with noise but with pressure, as Daniel turned the ignition and the engine hesitated, once, twice, a thin mechanical protest that felt like betrayal, and in the distance the sound finally reached them. Not a crash, not an explosion, but a growing roar that rolled through the valley like something enormous breathing in. The engine caught on the third turn, a rough, uneven growl that sounded smaller than it ever had before, and Daniel pressed the accelerator harder than he meant to, the truck jerking forward across dry ground, while Claire twisted in her seat to look behind them. The valley no longer shimmering but folding into movement, a wide dark line pushing outward, swallowing fence posts, flattening rows of early crops, carrying pieces of someone's shed like toys, and the sound, steady and growing, filled the air so completely it felt like it had weight, like it could press against their lungs and steal breath. The dirt road toward the low bridge was already wrong, dust lifting in confused spirals as if the air itself did not know which direction safety lay, and Daniel's hands tightened on the wheel, calculating distance without numbers, remembering the shallow bend in the river, remembering how spring floods sometimes cut new paths, and Claire saw the hesitation in his jaw, the moment where he measured speed against elevation, and she said, sharp but controlled, "The ridge, not the bridge." Because the bridge meant speed, but also meant guessing where the water would hit first, and guessing wrong was something they could not afford. They veered toward the narrow farm track that climbed toward the basalt rise behind their property, the tires slipping once in loose gravel, the truck fishtailing just enough to make Claire grab the dash, anger flashing through her fear, anger at the dam, at the calm voice on the radio, at the fact that they were being forced into a decision no one had prepared them for, and halfway up the incline, the engine sputtered again. Not dying, not yet, but choking as if dust or fuel or simple bad timing had chosen this moment to interfere, and Daniel felt a cold wave inside his chest that had nothing to do with the water racing below. Behind them, the first edge of the flood reached the farmhouse, not crashing through it but lifting around it, pressing against walls, turning the yard into a single moving surface, and Claire watched as the line of water climbed the porch steps with unsettling patience, as if testing each board before claiming it, and Daniel forced himself not to look, because looking backward was a luxury for people who had already survived, and instead he focused on the incline ahead, the truck straining, the engine knocking in uneven rhythm, and he whispered under his breath. Not a prayer, not exactly, just a promise to keep the wheels turning one more second, then another. The road narrowed near the top, rutted from years of runoff, and as they crested the final bend, the truck lurched violently, the rear tire spinning free in loose rock, the engine roaring uselessly, while below them the valley transformed into a single moving sheet, and Daniel slammed the gear into low, heart pounding with a mix of fury and fear, knowing that if the truck stalled here they would have to run on foot with the ground shaking beneath them, knowing that the ridge was close enough to see, yet still far enough to lose, and the roar behind them grew louder, closer, and impossibly fast. The rear tire caught for half a second, slipped again, then gripped hard enough to throw gravel against the undercarriage. And Daniel did not ease the throttle this time. He forced it, accepting the risk of burning the engine because the sound behind them was no longer distant. It was layered, water tearing through timber, metal bending, structures surrendering one after another. And Claire felt the vibration of it through the seat, through her spine, through her teeth, as if the valley itself had become a drum being struck over and over. They reached the ridge crest not in triumph, but in strain, the truck climbing the last meters with a sound that bordered on failure, and when the tires finally found level ground, Daniel kept driving, further up, further away from the slope, because stopping too soon felt like tempting something that was still moving, and only when the engine began to knock in protest did he brake. Both of them thrown forward slightly, breath catching in unison, and below them the world they had known was dissolving into motion. The farmhouse was still visible for a moment, tilted but standing, water swirling around it in tightening circles, and Claire gripped the door handle so hard her knuckles whitened, anger rising sharp and sudden. Anger that something built by years of work could be reduced to an obstacle in the river's path. And then the porch gave way. Not dramatically, not loudly, just folding inward as the water climbed higher, and Daniel reached across the cab and pulled her gaze back toward him. Not because he was unfeeling, but because watching would not change the outcome, and survival required focus more than mourning. The ridge was narrow, uneven, scattered with loose basalt and dry brush, and as they stepped out of the truck the wind shifted again, carrying mist and the sharp smell of churned earth. The sky still blue above them, painfully ordinary, as if unaware that below, fences, sheds, vehicles, and fields were being rewritten by force, and Claire turned in a slow circle, counting distances, measuring slopes, calculating whether this height would hold if the water rose further. And Daniel did the same without speaking, their silence thick not with confusion, but with concentration. Then they both saw it at once, the flood not spreading evenly, but angling toward the base of the ridge in a widening arc, debris collecting at a shallow dip that pointed directly beneath where they stood. And Daniel's jaw tightened again, because if enough force built there, if enough material jammed and redirected the current, the water could begin to climb, not gracefully, not predictably, and the ground beneath their boots felt suddenly less solid, less permanent. And Claire said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest, "This isn't high enough." And the realization settled between them like a second impact. Daniel did not argue. He only scanned higher along the ridgeline, where the basalt rose in uneven steps toward a rocky outcrop that overlooked the valley like a blunt edge. And without wasting another second, he grabbed the small toolbox from the truck bed and a coil of rope he kept for hauling feed, because tools meant options, and options meant time. And time was the only thing they could still fight for, while below them the water struck the base of the ridge with a force that made the ground tremble in short, violent pulses. They moved fast but not blindly, each step chosen, each patch of loose stone tested before committing weight, the roar below swelling and shifting as debris collided and separated, a barn roof spinning once before breaking apart, tree trunks twisting in slow arcs before disappearing beneath foam, and Claire felt fear rising in waves. Not sharp panic, but a deep spreading dread, the kind that made breathing deliberate, measured, as if wasting air could somehow shorten the minutes they had left. Halfway up the incline, the wind changed direction again, pushing spray higher than it had any right to reach, dampening their clothes, chilling skin that had been warm seconds before, and Daniel risked a glance back, seeing that the dip at the base of the ridge had become a funnel, water striking it at an angle and beginning to climb in surges, not steady but pulsing, each wave slightly higher than the last, testing the slope. And he understood then that standing still would be surrender, because the river was adapting, and so must they. Claire slipped once, her boot sliding on loose gravel, and the toolbox clanged against rock as Daniel dropped it to grab her arm, the sound sharp and metallic against the constant thunder below. And for a second, anger flashed between them. Anger at weakness, at gravity, at the unfairness of having to be perfect when the world itself was collapsing. But it passed quickly, replaced by a tighter bond, a silent agreement that mistakes would be corrected instantly, not punished. They reached the rocky outcrop breathless and shaking, and from that height the scale of it became undeniable. The valley transformed into a moving inland sea, roads erased, property lines meaningless, the farmhouse now only a tilted fragment before vanishing completely. And Claire felt the loss like a physical blow, yet forced herself to focus on the edge beneath their feet, measuring whether even this height would hold, because the water was still rising, still pushing, and the ridge beneath them gave a faint, unsettling shift, as if reminding them that even stone could be persuaded to move. The rock beneath them shifted again, not collapsing but settling with a deep grinding sound that traveled through their boots and into their bones, and Daniel dropped to one knee, pressing his palm against the basalt as if he could feel the direction of the pressure, as if the earth might warn him before it surrendered, while below the flood struck the ridge in repeated surges, each impact followed by a brief, deceptive lull, the kind of pause that tempts belief before the next blow lands harder. Claire moved along the edge of the outcrop, forcing herself to look outward instead of downward, mapping what remained of the landscape, calculating distances to the higher hills beyond, knowing that if this ledge failed, they would have to move again with almost no margin for error. And she spotted a narrow spine of rock extending toward a steeper rise, unstable but elevated, a possible escape route if they were willing to cross it. And she pointed without speaking, because the roar made words feel small and fragile. Daniel followed her gaze and understood instantly that staying still was a gamble with shrinking odds. The water had begun to swirl tighter at the base, carrying heavy debris that slammed into the slope and dislodged stones in unpredictable bursts, and one large impact could trigger a slide. Not dramatic, not cinematic, but enough to tilt their footing and send them scrambling. And he felt a flash of anger at how every choice demanded risk. how there was no safe option, only less dangerous ones. A section of the lower ridge sheared away without warning, not in a dramatic collapse, but in a grinding downward slump. Soil and brush sliding into the torrent with a muffled roar, and the vibration rippled upward, knocking loose small stones near their feet, and Claire staggered back, heart pounding with sudden clarity, because now the threat was visible, tangible. The slope was being eaten from below, and the question was no longer if it would continue, but how fast. Daniel grabbed the rope and looped it around his waist, then around Claire's, not as a guarantee, but as a promise that if one slipped, the other would fight to hold, and together they stepped onto the narrow spine of rock, the wind pushing against them, spray stinging their faces. The valley behind transformed beyond recognition, and as they began the careful crossing toward higher ground, the ridge beneath their starting point cracked again, a sharp splitting sound that erased any illusion of safety they had just left behind. The spine of rock was narrower than it had looked from a distance, barely wider than the length of Daniel's boot, and the wind pressed against them with steady force, not violent, but relentless, forcing them to lean forward as they moved, step by deliberate step, the rope between them tight enough to remind them that neither could afford panic. And below, the flood no longer roared in a single tone, but in layers. Wood striking stone, metal scraping, currents colliding and folding over one another like something alive and restless. Claire kept her eyes fixed on the higher rise ahead, refusing to look down at the churning mass that had replaced fields and roads. But even without looking, she could feel its presence, the vibration traveling up through the rock, small tremors that made each foothold uncertain, and halfway across the spine, a sudden jolt shook the stone beneath them, not enough to throw them off balance, but enough to steal breath, and Daniel felt the rope snap taut as Claire stumbled, her boots skidding on loose grit before catching again. They froze in place, not from hesitation, but from calculation, because movement during instability could be worse than stillness, and for 3 long seconds the world reduced itself to sound and balance, wind against ears, water below, heartbeats loud and uneven, and when the tremor passed, Daniel nodded once, a silent command to continue, and they resumed with even slower precision, aware now that the ridge they were crossing was not a fixed path, but a fragile one. Behind them, the outcrop they had left gave way in a larger collapse, a heavy section breaking free and sliding into the torrent with a deep rolling crash, sending a spray of water and debris upward, and the shock wave rippled through the spine, shifting stones under their boots. Claire gasped as one rock tilted beneath her weight, and Daniel dropped low, bracing himself, pulling the rope tight to anchor her long enough for her to regain footing, his muscles burning not from exertion alone, but from the knowledge that this narrow line of stone was the only thing separating them from the flood's reach. The higher rise was only yards away now, steep but solid, and Daniel forced his body forward, despite the fatigue creeping into his legs, despite the cold spray soaking through his clothes, and when they finally stepped onto the firmer slope beyond the spine, both of them collapsed to their knees for a brief second, not in relief, but in exhaustion, because the water was still rising, still searching for weaknesses, and the valley below showed no sign of slowing, only spreading wider, pressing harder, as if testing whether even this height would eventually be claimed. The higher rise felt solid under their boots, dense basalt that did not shift when tested, and for a moment Daniel allowed himself a single steady breath. But the relief did not settle, because from this vantage point the scale of the flood was clearer, the water no longer confined to the valley floor but spreading outward in widening arcs, finding every shallow path, every forgotten dip in the land, and Claire could see that the surge was not a single wall, but a series of pulses, each one pushing farther than the last. They climbed again, slower now, conserving strength, the slope steeper and scattered with scrub that tore at their sleeves, and Daniel kept glancing toward a cluster of taller hills beyond, calculating whether this rise would remain above the highest reach, knowing that if the flood found another channel, if debris formed a temporary barrier and redirected the force, Even this elevation could become uncertain, and the weight of responsibility pressed against him heavier than the wind. A sudden crack split the air behind them, sharp and echoing, and when they turned, they saw a line opening along the face of the ridge they had just crossed, not dramatic but decisive. The rock separating along a fault that had been invisible minutes earlier, and sections began to slide, slowly at first, then accelerating, carrying brush and loose stone downward into the torrent. And Claire felt the shock of it in her chest, because the path they had taken was gone, erased as if it had never existed. The loss of that route changed something in both of them. The awareness that retreat was no longer possible, that forward was the only direction left. And Daniel's anger hardened into focus, into a quiet refusal to let the river decide more than it already had. And he motioned Claire upward again, toward a small plateau near the crest where the ground leveled slightly, high enough to offer distance from the surging water yet exposed to wind and uncertainty. When they reached the plateau, the wind struck harder, unobstructed, carrying mist that blurred the edges of the valley below. And Claire wrapped her arms around herself, not from cold alone, but from the realization that the water was still rising, creeping higher along the slopes in uneven surges. And Daniel measured the distance between their boots and the nearest advancing edge, calculating silently, understanding that survival now depended not on speed, but on endurance, because the flood had not yet finished testing how high they were willing to climb. The plateau offered space, but not comfort, a stretch of uneven stone exposed to wind that seemed to grow colder as the minutes passed. And Daniel understood that height alone was not protection, because the flood below was still reorganizing itself, currents colliding, debris forming temporary dams that shifted and broke without warning, sending new surges in unpredictable directions. And Claire watched one of those surges strike the slope beneath them, climbing higher than the last, hesitating for a breath before sliding back, leaving dark wet scars across rock that had been dry moments earlier. They moved toward the highest point of the plateau, a jagged crown of basalt that rose another few feet, not much, but enough to change the angle from which the water would have to reach them. And Daniel tested each step before committing weight, his movements slower now, not from fear, but from fatigue settling deep into muscle, while Claire scanned the horizon beyond the flooded valley, searching for any sign of response, any movement that suggested they were not alone in this unfolding disaster. The wind shifted again, carrying with it a new sound layered beneath the roar, faint at first, almost lost in the chaos, and Claire lifted her head sharply, straining to isolate it, because it did not match the rhythm of water or collapsing timber. It was mechanical, distant, but steady. And Daniel heard it too, a low rhythmic thrum that rose and fell with the wind. And for a moment, hope flared too quickly, too dangerously, because hope without confirmation could break concentration. Below them, another section of slope gave way, sliding in a heavy cascade that sent a fresh surge upward, water striking the base of the plateau with renewed force, spraying higher than before. And Claire stepped back instinctively as droplets hit her face, cold and sharp. And Daniel felt the tremor through his boots, the reminder that the ground was not immune, that even this elevated crown was being tested. And the mechanical sound in the distance wavered, drowned briefly by the roar before returning, slightly louder. Daniel climbed the final few feet to the jagged crown and stood tall despite the wind pushing against him, scanning the sky now instead of the valley. And there, far beyond the drifting mist, a small shape cut across the horizon, banking slowly, methodically, and Claire followed his gaze, heart pounding with equal parts relief and fear, because the helicopter was real, but it was distant, and the water beneath them was still rising, still pressing against the edges of the plateau as if determined to claim every last inch before help could reach them. The helicopter circled once, distant and methodical, as if the sky itself were studying the valley before committing to it, and Daniel raised both arms despite the wind pushing against him, knowing that from that height they were no more than shapes against stone, small and easy to miss. while below the flood continued its restless climb, striking the base of the plateau in uneven surges that sent cold spray across their boots and reminded them that time was not pausing simply because hope had appeared on the horizon. Claire pulled the coil of rope free from Daniel's waist and began swinging it slowly above her head. Not wildly, not in panic, but in a steady arc meant to catch light and motion, and the effort burned through her shoulders, fatigue mixing with determination. Because the helicopter did not change direction at first, it held its path, drifting slightly down valley as if drawn toward another unseen point. And for a terrifying stretch of seconds, the distance between them and that small machine seemed to widen rather than shrink. Another surge slammed into the lower slope, stronger than the last, and this time the vibration reached the plateau with enough force to rattle loose stones around their feet. A sharp reminder that the water was still rearranging the land beneath them. And Daniel felt anger flare again, not at the helicopter, not at the pilot who could not possibly see every survivor at once, but at the unfairness of being so close to rescue and still within reach of loss. And he climbed higher onto the jagged crown, risking balance for visibility. The helicopter banked again, this time lower, and the mechanical thrum deepened into a distinct chopping rhythm that cut through wind and water alike, and Claire's heart pounded so hard it blurred her vision, because now the aircraft was angled toward their rise, moving carefully against turbulent air rising from the heated, flooded valley. And she understood that even rescue carried danger, that the pilot would have to judge distance and wind and space with precision while they remained exposed on unstable ground. The flood struck once more, a heavy pulse that sent a sheet of water sliding higher along the rock face, stopping only yards below where they stood. And Daniel locked eyes with Claire, no words needed, both aware that if the plateau failed now, there would be no second chance. And above them, the helicopter tilted into a controlled hover, lowering slightly, the downdraft whipping spray and dust into spirals around their bodies. Close enough now to see movement in the cockpit, close enough to know they had been seen, but not yet close enough to feel safe. The helicopter held its hover against the unstable air, blades cutting through mist and dust, the downdraft flattening scrub around Daniel and Claire, as if the mountain itself were bowing under pressure, and for a suspended moment, the world reduced to three forces: water rising from below, wind pressing from above, and two people standing between them with nothing left but endurance, while the pilot adjusted position inch by careful inch, searching for a stable angle over ground that was still shifting. A rescue crewman leaned out, harness secured, scanning the plateau with focused precision, and Daniel felt a surge of urgency that bordered on desperation, because the flood struck again, harder than before, sending a violent tremor through the basalt crown, small cracks snapping outward beneath their boots, and Claire staggered but did not fall, her jaw set, eyes fixed upward, refusing to look at the dark water that now glistened only a short distance below, climbing in uneven, testing surges. The cable began to descend, swaying in the turbulent air, metallic and deliberate, and Daniel grabbed it first, steadying its swing long enough for the hook to settle within reach, and he secured Claire into the harness with hands that shook not from fear, but from exhaustion and cold, checking each clasp twice, because a single careless movement could undo everything they had survived. And when he nodded, she met his eyes with fierce clarity, anger and relief intertwined, neither willing to leave without the other, yet knowing there was no time for argument. Claire rose first, lifted slowly from the rock as spray lashed against her boots, the rope between them now replaced by the taut rescue line. And Daniel watched her ascend into the wash of air, feeling the plateau tremble again beneath his feet as another surge struck the slope below. Stones shifting, edges crumbling, and he understood with sudden sharp certainty that they had reached the limit of what the ridge would endure, that seconds mattered now more than ever before. When the cable descended again, Daniel clipped himself in with a final glance at the valley that had been their home, now transformed beyond recognition. Fields erased, roads vanished, the river no longer confined but sprawling, wide and indifferent. And as the helicopter lifted him clear, the basalt crown fractured beneath, a section breaking free and sliding into the flood in a heavy cascade, the sound swallowed by wind and engine, and suspended above it all. Daniel felt not triumph, but a quiet, steady realization that survival had not been strength alone, nor luck alone, but the refusal to stop choosing, even when every choice carried risk. And as the helicopter turned toward higher ground, the rising water finally began to slow, its force spent, leaving behind a scarred valley and 2 lives still intact. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to read more survival stories.